So block explorers, everybody's used a block explorer. Kind of one of the things people don't really talk about is like they're kind of not that good. They're kind of antithetical to Bitcoin, and they kind of have some strange trade-offs that not everybody really knows about. So yeah, a block explorer, of course, everybody looks like this. Blockchain.info is kind of the popular one. For many years, it has been sort of the most widely used one. Blockstream.info is a new one that came along. There's also like Blockchair, and BitPay has its Insight thing. There's several around there that you can do basically the same thing. So the fundamental problem in a block explorer is you're not actually, so when you're looking up the balance of your Bitcoin on a particular address, you're asking somebody else to tell you the answer. You're trusting that they're giving you the right answer. You're kind of abdicating your sort of Bitcoin responsibility to verify everything. Bitcoin works because everybody verifies everything. Is that you as an individual participate in the network, and you actually determine the state of the ledger by running the software. So as soon as you say, oh, I don't want to do that, that sounds hard, I'm going to just ask someone else who's going to go do it for me. You're delegating basically your vote on the network to that person. So in a way, a site like this has disproportionate kind of power in that if they're displaying things in certain ways and leading you to believe things based on what their website is returning back to you, that's kind of, it represents a systemic risk. That's kind of the first philosophical objection to block explorers. Kind of the first really big practical problem with it is as soon as you're typing your address into this, you can make a fairly high probabilistic guess that the person that's looking up that address might actually own the private keys to that Bitcoin. So if you're holding a decent amount of money, say like 1 Bitcoin, that's a chunk of money, and you're typing your address into a block explorer to check if you still have that 1 Bitcoin, this website knows what your IP address is, and they know something, they can find out things about your browser. And if you're logged in on social media, like if you're on Facebook or Google or Twitter or something like that, they can potentially correlate to say, not only like is that IP likely holding that Bitcoin, but that person, here's their photo, here's where they live, their home address, their family. These are all things that are now correlated with that balance of Bitcoin. So yeah, that's in a country like Canada, maybe that's you're not too worried about somebody coming to threaten you to try and steal your Bitcoin, but there's plenty of countries that don't have such good rule of law, where there's things like kidnapping and extortion and these sort of things. If you're revealing that you own Bitcoin, you're opening yourself up to potentially violence, right? So just from what we know about how browsers and the internet works, the internet is a big tracking machine, and this is a big honeypot for tracking stuff about who owns what Bitcoin. The other thing is blockchain.info used to be like a perfectly fine company. Everybody liked blockchain.info, but then they screwed up a bunch of things, and their CEO said some things that weren't very credible, and some of the good employees that maybe first started with it have left, and blockchain.info really doesn't do anything anymore. Really, the only value is that people just keep using it, right? There's lots of eyeballs, which translates to money in some way. So even though maybe this is a perfectly fine company today, where is this company going to be 5 years, 10 years down the road? And did they delete all the data that they collected during the time? So that data is now a honeypot that somebody could go buy as an asset. So if you see something like that, like blockchain, I don't know how they make money. I guess they have some services and some wallets or whatever, but it can't be a lot of money. Really, the value of this company is the fact that people are inputting their data into it about what Bitcoin they own, which is kind of sketchy. And yeah, even so, like Blockstream has an explorer, which is people like Blockstream. Blockstream does a lot of good stuff that I use, I appreciate. Blockstream's a very good company in the space. However, as time goes on, remember Google when it started, it was all don't be evil and yeah, we're helping the world and all these other things. And like over the decades, some of those things tend to be less true. So even if you're using a block explorer from a company you like and you trust, as those employees leave and turn over and different people are in charge or they have like revenue problems and all these other things down the road, they might become sort of the same thing there. So in a nutshell, I'd say that's the problem with the block explorer. Back in Boston Pizza, over a year ago, I demoed this, panopticlick.eff.org. So if you go on this website, you click a button, it runs an analysis of your browser. And I ran this, I just screenshotted it. But you see, your browser fingerprint appears to be unique amongst the 200,000 tested. So what this is telling me is without any cookies, without anything, is that this website can tell me, or can tell that I'm a unique person amongst 200,000 people that have used this tool, just based on what the JavaScript can kind of pull out of the browser. So like the fonts that have been installed, what my resolution is, what time zone I'm in, some of the headers that are in my browser, what OS I'm running, what version of Firefox this happens to be, WebGL fingerprint. I don't know what all these things are, but this is all information that's leaking out of your browser that any site could be sniffing on and tell that you are a unique user. And then as soon as you take that browser to social media, like if you go on your Facebook account with that same browser, somebody can then say, oh yeah, that's not just that unique browser, but that's a name and a face. So yeah, Electronic Freedom Foundation has been popularizing, just how bad privacy is. They're a nonprofit that do that. So yeah, it's a problem and nobody has a good answer to it. We just kind of accept now that everything on the internet is tracked and you just can't do anything about it. So that's the context of the world right now. Okay, so say you have Bitcoin and you want to protect that Bitcoin, you kind of don't want it to be knowledge that you own that Bitcoin, just for your own safety and your own privacy. What can you do? So the thing you're supposed to do in Bitcoin is you're supposed to run a node. You're supposed to verify. You don't want to trust, you want to verify. So that means running a node and participating as a first-class participant in the network. So that thing that's reading the blocks off in the background, my Raspberry Pi at the front door, it's validating all the blocks. It's making all the determinations itself, what all the balances are. So you could use a node like that or run a node on your laptop or on your PC to have the full state of the blockchain. And instead of asking a website, you're asking your own computer, which you own, it's there to serve you. If you're running Linux, you've installed Linux. It's not Microsoft that can do things in the background. It's your own kind of sovereign property. And it's your own sovereign property that's then looking stuff up privately. So to be able to determine a balance of an address, for example, you can do that entirely self-contained in your computer. So there's no network traffic that has to go out to go talk to somebody else. It's just computation that this computer can do. It can tell you what your balance is. So that's great in theory. And myself, I'm a trained computer engineer, software developer. This is fairly easy. But yeah, I can certainly see why this is kind of intimidating if you are, kind of not used to like command line arguments and Linux and all these other things. But I can tell you that yeah, this is hard to learn. But like anything, if you spend hours and a couple weeks and you just keep at it, you learn it. It's a skill, and you kind of adapt to it. So like, me to just figure this all out, it took me 5 minutes to remember what the commands are. Bang, I've done it. And you can look up, if you get good at like looking up the documentation and all these other things. So the way that you check the balance of an address is, so once you're running a node, you can get on the CLI, You go import address and you give it like the address, so the address that starts with a 1 or a 3, that full cryptographic thing goes there. You give it a name, so it could be anything, just so you don't have to remember that. You can just remember it like the easy name. The next parameter you give is true, and that tells it to rescan the entire blockchain. Oh, sorry, no, wait. I should have actually written this down. So you tell it that it's a watch-only address. So one of these, I believe the true there is a watch-only address. So what that means is this node doesn't actually own the money. It doesn't have the private key associated with that address. All it's doing is it's going to set itself up to know the balance of that address. You're importing that address, and without the private key, it can figure out everything about that particular address. So when you do that, and in fact, the entire, it takes like an hour. If you have a fast hard drive, it's about an hour. If you have a slow hard drive, it could be several hours. It has to go rescan through the entire blockchain, which is like 250 gigs plus right now. So yeah, it might take a couple hours. But it looks through every transaction on the blockchain to find out whether that address was involved. And it just keeps track of everything having to do with that address. And you can add multiple addresses in at the same time. So if you own multiple addresses or you're interested in multiple addresses, you can load them all in and then do a rescan, and it'll just index everything to do with those addresses. The reason you have to do that as a separate step is it's like just too much for the software to track everything about every address. It's just, that's a lot of database indexing. You have to opt in to index certain things. That's just how it is. So once you've done that and the node has finished rescanning, you can use the list unspent command. And out of the addresses that have been loaded in, it'll show the unspent outputs. So this is, of course, getting into the details of Bitcoin, but there's no balance on an address, there's just outputs. So an address could have multiple outputs associated with it. So if somebody paid me 1 Bitcoin and another person paid me 2 Bitcoin, I'd have 2 outputs. One that's 1 Bitcoin and the other that's 2. Nowhere will it say that I have 3 Bitcoin. It just says that you have 2 outputs. And here's 1 and here's 2. So I'll walk through this briefly on what this actually looks like. But yeah, once you have a notion that there's a transaction involved in this with this address, you can get the raw transaction, then you can decode it to actually observe every single detail about that transaction. So what does that look like? Ooh, scary. Skipping how you import it, I'll just go straight to the list unspent. But yeah, you go list unspent. So this is actually an address that Dean and I set up as a donation address for Forkdrop. So this is public. This is money that people have donated to our company just for supporting it. So it's not a lot of money, but that's our published address. So I set this up to watch that address. So several people have donated various amounts. And yeah, so now that's recorded in the blockchain. Nobody's donated in a long time, actually. So these are buried fairly deep, so you can see how many confirmation each of these outputs have. And it shows the TX ID, and then also important is the V out. It's the output of that transaction that belongs to this particular address. So again, if you're not familiar with this stuff, this is very kind of confusing. There's a lot of kind of details you need to understand, but this is using pure Bitcoin. This is like how it works under the hood, which is fairly important. So for this, I think I grabbed 7CA. So I just took this transaction, V out number 2. So I'm going to drill in on this transaction. So you go get raw transaction, and then you give it to the transaction ID. And once you do that, it gives you this big, large blob of hex. So this is actually the raw bytes that are the transaction, that the thing that gets broadcast to the network. This is the thing that you pay the Satoshi per byte fee on. So if you summed up all these bytes, and then if you're paying 1 Satoshi per fee, it would line up to how many bytes those are, with some caveats. But yeah, this is the raw data of the transaction. It holds everything about that transaction. So Once you have that hex, you can feed that back into the decode raw transaction command. This is actually a very long piece of output. This top right here is the continuation right here. This is just the same thing continued up here, so I could fit it on the slide. So if you decode it, yeah, it tells you the transaction ID, the different things about the size. Yeah, that was 482 bytes. So if I were paying 1 Satoshi per byte, I'd be paying 482 Satoshis to broadcast that. The first section here, this is JSON, which is just a descriptive language that is decoding this. You can't read the hex, of course, nobody can read that. But once you decode it, it kind of displays it in a very readable format if you know how to read it, which is this. So the first thing is the inputs. So there's 2 inputs. So whoever spent this transaction is spending coins from these couple outputs. And there's not a lot of details about that, which is another kind of nuance of Bitcoin. It doesn't double record various pieces of information. If you want to drill into that, you'd have to then go look up these transaction IDs to find out the details of where these coins actually came from. Because this is our address, we own this address, we're usually more interested in the outputs, the V out, which just starts up here. It's the same thing as I mentioned. So there's, of this transaction, whoever sent it actually spent to 4 different people. And it's likely one of those 4 is just his change address. Because like if you have some amount and you don't want to spend all of it, you're going to spend some of it back to yourself as change. So that's probably one of these. But our address is actually this one. So at this time, whoever put this together decided I'm going to pay that person, that person, that person, and then maybe back to myself as change. Put this all through, and this happens to be our address, which is value n equals 2. So as I mentioned, these are the V outs. So when I picked this one, V out 2, that's the same as us being number 2 of the outs. So what you see here, this is the raw transaction. This is what the block explorers are parsing through and displaying to you in a very friendly format. This is obviously fairly unfriendly, but it's how Bitcoin works. And if you're really into Bitcoin, like me, I am really into Bitcoin. I go learn all this stuff, and it's very fascinating. If you read some of these more heftier books, like Andreas's Mastering Bitcoin, he'll walk you through all this, what all this means, and what's going on here. But yeah, this is really what you have to learn to really get into the guts of Bitcoin. Not everybody's going to do that. Still, like, it's very hard. So here's what's another compromise you can make if you don't want to learn all that, and you don't want to use the block explorer. Well, so there is the possibility for yourself, if you want, you can run your own block explorer. You won't have to write any code. It is kind of hard to set up, but Blockstream's eSplora, so the thing that's on blockstream.info, all of that source code is on GitHub. And they have documentation about how to set it up. BitPay also has their block explorer, and that's also open source. So you can download this code, run it on your own machine. It's not super easy. If you're a web developer kind of person, you can figure it out. It might be a good project to take on. You're not going to finish in one day, probably, if you've never done anything like this before. I'll admit I've never done this. I looked at the directions. I'm like, oh, this takes too much time. I'm just going to do this. So yeah, you can do that. So this is the benefit of, like, not only are you running a node on your computer, but you're telling it to go grind through all the blockchain data and to make a database that's very nice and looks exactly like a block explorer, and it lives on your laptop in a self-contained way. If you're querying this block explorer, you're not leaking any privacy. It's your own computer, it's your own business. Another thing worth mentioning is Electrum Server. So it's not really a block explorer, but it does kind of the same thing as these bits of software. It takes this data, it grinds through, and it produces some sort of nice, more intelligible queries of, like, kind of that's a little more human oriented. So yeah, you can find out more complicated things in more straightforward ways. So this kind of solves some of that problem. And yeah, Electrum's a whole other interesting discussion with how SPV wallets and all that work. Yeah, so the whole point there is index the blockchain yourself. So you run a full node and then you index the entire blockchain yourself, and now you got a nice fun browser experience. You can go browse what's on the blockchain. Okay, that's very hard. So again, not everybody's a web developer, not everybody's gonna spend the week or whatever it takes to actually learn that. So let's find an easier way, and this is starting to be not as good as the other solutions. You're still sort of trusting somebody else, not verifying it, but if you're really interested in protecting your privacy, it's better than nothing. So what I would recommend is use a thing called Tor browser. So Tor browser, I demoed this at the Boston Pizza thing however long ago. But it's entire, so like you would download Chrome or Firefox or whatever else, Opera, whatever your browser is. It's a fully ready to go browser. It's actually based on Firefox, but it's a standalone application that you install separate from Firefox. And when you open it up, it only connects through Tor. So again, Tor is the onion router. So it's an anonymous network that echoes all your internet traffic through multiple hops that are wrapped in layers of encryption, such that the server doesn't know who's asking for the data, unlike the regular internet where they know who's asking for the data. So it's a thing much like, it's a nonprofit, much like the EFF. They developed this browser as sort of a countermeasure to all of the tracking that goes on, and they try to make it very easy for people that aren't as sophisticated to just download it and start using it. And actually I have it installed, which I'll show just briefly in a moment. But I'll talk about Tails first. So Tails is another thing that uses Tor. It's a thing that will, you put it on a DVD and you boot off of it like you would like your install disk for Windows. You boot off this, it boots you into a Linux environment, and that Linux environment only talks through Tor. So that's what you call like a live system. And yeah, the Tails acronym is the Anonymous Incognito Live System, called Tails. So those are two ways you can access Tor. Once you're on Tor, if you go to the blockstream.info, if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see these onion links. These onion links are made for accessing through Tor, and I have this set up. So actually, if I just exit out of this very briefly, I'll come right back. So I installed, this is Tor browser right here. So yeah, right here it's giving me a hint. It says don't maximize it because that'll tell everybody what my resolution is, and then if somebody with this resolution goes from here to there, they can use that to correlate it. So they say, don't maximize your screen. So it's a browser that's really watching out for your privacy. So just go OK. So what I did in just a notepad right here, these are the blockstream.info onion version 2 and version 3. I'll take the version 3. So if you know the address of Blockstream, which is this cryptographic key, so like a Bitcoin address, this is a cryptographic key that tells the public key of the server I want to talk to. So if I do this, now Tor is kind of slow. It's not too bad. It's a little bit slower than the normal web. But here through Tor, I've now accessed the Block Explorer. So what this does is on Blockstream's end, they have no idea who's actually asking for these addresses that you're looking up. They have no idea. Tor hides that from them. And they don't know like what country you're in or where or anything about you. And you can use their Block Explorer anonymously. Now that isn't perfect. So for example, like if you have 5 Bitcoin addresses, that you have your coins spread across 5, and you look them all up in rapid succession, you're leaking information to them that these 5 addresses probably belong to the same person. Probabilistically, they probably belong to the same person. So yeah, they would still gather that data, but other than that, like all those browser things that the Panopticlick was showing, they don't get any of that info, and they don't get any of your social media or whatever other cookies that might be on your system. So that's the Tor browser in a nutshell. So if you've never heard of the Tor browser, it's well worth learning about. The torproject.org. Read about it on Wikipedia, all these other things. It's a very important project by my estimate. Lightning Network and Bitcoin itself are enabled to connect through Tor. So in the same way, like if you live in a country that maybe doesn't like Bitcoin, I don't know, Venezuela is one to pull out of a hat. If you live in Venezuela, you probably don't want to be running a Bitcoin node out of your home, because like that would probably get you on somebody's radar. So in the same way, if you want to hide the fact that you're running a node, what you could do is connect through Tor, so that whoever in Venezuela is sniffing everybody's traffic, they only see this encrypted stuff go by. They don't see that, hey, somebody's running Bitcoin on that computer with that address. Right now I run a Bitcoin node from home. I have Shaw internet. Shaw can probably figure out that I'm a Bitcoiner because I'm running Bitcoin, and they know what account I am and what my street address is and all my billing details, et cetera. They can figure that out. If I didn't want that, I would run the node through Tor and hide that fact. Okay, so this is the easy. That one's a little harder. I guess this one's the hardest, but is the best. And this is kind of a conglomeration of all these other things. So if you're really into Bitcoin and you're like, I got to learn computers at a deeper level, it's kind of sparked you in that way. Python is a language that they teach to kids. It's a pretty great introductory language where there's lots of tutorials available. Tutorials written for literally like 10-year-olds about Python. So there's no difficulty getting started. I mean, it's you got to put effort in to learn Python. But this stuff right here is very complicated, but what this is, it's meant to be programmed against. So rather than me try to like parse through this and like read the details, the reason it's done this way is such that somebody can write a Python script and do their own logic to figure out the thing that they need to figure it out. So yeah, that's kind of like the next stage of Bitcoin, is like learning to program Bitcoin. So like Jimmy Song is going around teaching courses on how to program Bitcoin using Python. I think he charges a couple $1,000s for it. But he also wrote a book, so you just buy his book, I guess. Similarly, like when we did Forkdrop, we wrote code that runs on Tails. So we were automating some things using the RPC calls. But we wanted to protect people's privacy, so we deployed it on Tails. So what our guides say is, okay, boot into Tails, pull down this code, run this code. And this code is reaching through on the internet through Tor to figure out what it needs to figure out. And so we did that in a way that could preserve the user privacy. What this is a little script that I just grabbed that I use to check the Bitcoin price. Everybody checks the Bitcoin price. Why not automate that? So BitPay publishes all their exchange rates for all their retail payment services. So in Python, you use the request library, you grab that at that URL, you parse the JSON, like as I mentioned, this is JSON. So this is kind of a structured format that kind of puts brackets around things that makes it easy to parse, such that if you do have some blob of JSON like that, you can just load it. In most programming languages have a nice JSON library. And I look through this data I get, and I find CAD. It has all the world currencies. It has like 20 or 50 or whatever world currencies, the euro, the whatever, Venezuelan bolivar. Iterates through there, finds the one that labeled CAD, and it gets the rate. And so that's the instantaneous Bitcoin to Canadian dollar price. So it would just be more programming, but in Python, not too much code. It would get the Canadian price. It would check all my addresses on my hard drive, find out the unspent addresses, and then just sum up how much Bitcoin I own. And that would be relatively trustless. I mean, at the very least, At the very least, it is querying out to this, but I'm only leaking the fact that I'm checking the price. I'm not going on to blockchain.info to check my price. I'm using just the feed, and then everything else I'm getting directly from the node. So these are kind of like, little simple programming projects you could start doing if you're learning Python. So again, it's not simple. You have to put time in. You know, not trivial, but I'd say that this is a great life skill, particularly if you plan on being in Bitcoin for a while. So that's all I have for that presentation.